Hey, Josh, welcome to the Beyond Jaws podcast. Are you ready to talk about sharks?
I was born ready.
I love that. Love the laugh on that. That was awesome.
Yeah, that's what we love to hear, Josh. I really want to just welcome Dr. Josh Moyer onto the show today. He actually was on one of the earlier episodes, bonus episode 4 last year, talking about his time of being a student of Dr. Dominic Didier at Millersville University when Josh was an undergrad. Josh did his Bachelor of Science degree in biology at Millersville University in Pennsylvania. He also did his Master's of Science degree in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Cornell University, and his PhD in Orgasmic and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Josh currently a lecturer at the Yale University, and he's chair of the American Elasmobranch Society Outreach and Education Committee. He's also a lead instructor for the massive open online course on sharks, which is also referred to as the Shark MOOC. And as I mentioned, he's already been on the episode 4. And Josh, welcome back, buddy.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back. I'll make a quick note that I do get very excited by ecology and evolutionary biology, but my PhD is in organismic and evolutionary biology.
I was waiting for that.
I'm sorry.
No, that's quite all right.
I'm gonna.
I was waiting. I was like, did he just say what I think he said?
Know, some people are really excited by evolutionary biology.
I get really excited.
I don't judge them. I don't judge
so excited about it.
Hey.
Takes all kinds.
That was
right?
great call. That was awesome. I love that call out. That was perfect. Josh, it is great to have you back on the show. And why don't we just refresh? I know we talked a lot about how you got into shark science and so forth. Why don't you just kind of remind the people, like, what got you into loving sharks or even just marine science in general?
I'll just say it really goes back to having parents that enabled the interest. When I was, 4 years old or so, my parents said to me, you're going to have a baby brother or a baby sister, at which point I just sort of said, why? If you don't like my work, you don't need to bring other people into this, But that was a 4-year-old's grasp of family planning, I guess. So anyway, my mom said, well, look, we'll have some quality time together before the baby comes. And one of the things that she did was take me to the local library, and she would say, pick out any book that you want, and we'll go home, we'll read it together, And okay, cool, wonderful. So we would go to the library, and one day I went back to the nature section of the kids' sort of collection, and I picked out a book about sharks. We went home. My mom read it to me, and I'm looking at the pictures, and I guess something clicked because the next day we went back to the same section, got another book, another shark book, went home, read that one too. A couple years go by, I graduate to the adult section, so now I'm looking at the field guides and things like that. And then when I got to the age where people started asking that dreaded question, what do you want to be when you grow up? I stopped and I thought, well, my interest in sharks is still there. I still love reading these books, and I love to, when I go to the aquarium or go to the beach, I love to see these things. So what do you need to be to work with sharks? And then, of course, people said, oh, you want to be a marine biologist? And I said, sure, let's call it that. I'll be a marine biologist. Sounds good.
I love it. And was this in high school at this point that you're like, okay, I'll be a marine biologist, or a little younger?
Yeah, it was high school, middle school, 6th, 7th grade is when people start planting the seed, saying, okay, what's the bigger world like outside of school? What do people do for a living? And so that's when those questions started coming up, and that's when I started looking around and saying, well, the phrase marine biology keeps being brought up. Whenever I tell adults that I'm interested in sharks, they respond with, oh, are you going to be a marine biologist? Well, sure. Okay, if that's what I need to be, that's what I'll be.
What did your high school guidance counselor say when you saw him or her?
Here's the thing, Dave. I never really gave anybody the impression that I was looking for input because I knew what I wanted to do.
I was the same way. Same way.
Same way.
And so I would always listen to people and I mean, and this is one of those things where you say, okay, you got to take some things with a grain of salt. Some pieces of input you sort of file away and you say, that's interesting, but I don't really see that. I don't know about the rest of your listeners, but I know when I was in high school, they had you take placement tests, to tell you what sort of areas of work you might be well suited for, given your temperament and your aptitudes and things like that. And the one test that I took said, okay, you should either be a biologist or you should be a tank gunner.
I got those tests too. Yeah. It was always military or something cool. Right. Not that the military isn't cool, but military is something cool.
Well, yes, military or something exotic and atypical.
Right.
I mean, hats off to the folks in the military. That's absolutely a valid career path. But it does sort of make me scratch my head and say, okay, who sponsored this aptitude test? I need to look on the back and see if there's some government funding coming through.
If I can inject from Mike, 'cause I'm a bit older than you guys. Like when I did the thing, I had like Explorer or Special Forces military, and I was like right at the tail end of the Vietnam era. They'd done the draft like another year. I was like I was up for it. So it was like I had my experience when they did it for me. It was like a little more real to me as far as
a little more of a looming prospect there. Yeah.
Like, let's see. I could study. I could be an explorer. I could go be a special forces guy. So, anyway, it's kind of had a little different meaning for me.
The path not taken, right? We all have one.
Well, I knew what I wanted to do. So, sharks, great.
Exactly. Yep.
So everybody knows. I mean, I first got to know Josh when he was doing his undergraduate degree with Dr. Dominic Didier, who we had on, I think it was episode 5 last year of our thing. She has a pretty incredible journey as well in this type of research she did. And that was like where it was, and working with Dominique, Josh, just to refresh the audience, that was when you really kind of had like you're actually working with somebody in the field doing shark research?
Yes. Yeah. So up until that point, I knew that I was interested in sharks, and I had seen sharks. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, so I would go to the Jersey Shore, and I would do surf fishing. And when I was a real little kid and I wasn't fishing myself, I would be running back and forth between the people doing the surf doing the surf fishing and saying, "Hey, did you catch any sharks? Oh, that's a sand shark. Can I see that? Can I? But yeah, it wasn't until I got to college that Dominique really said, okay, here's how you put together a research project. It's all well and good to think sharks are awesome and they're really neat and you have all the trivia memorized, but until you can apply those facts, until you can craft a research question, a hypothesis, and really mine the literature to figure out what's been done before you came along, then you're still in the kiddie pool. We need to get you into the adult section, the adult pool, the deep end. And so she was the one that sort of took me out of the kiddie pool, if you will, and put me in the deep end of shark research and started connecting me to people like Dave and other AES members. And that was really sort of the big door that just opened up, and I could see the light coming from the other side and saying, oh, I feel like I've taken my first steps into a much larger, more fascinating world of shark biology. And I have her to thank for that. I really do.
What was do you remember your first study or your first participation for field work with sharks?
I don't think you ever really forget your first field study. And the background here is well, unless you're a couple decades in like Dave, age takes its toll. Right?
He may not remember.
I may not remember that.
I think most young whippersnappers like myself would remember. But anyway, the background here is that working with Dominique, I went into her office after an endocrinology lecture. So I was taking endocrinology with the person who she's now married to, Jim Cosentino. And so I was sitting in his endocrinology lecture, and we were talking about blood chemistry and the different types of hormones that you find in the blood. And I was thinking to myself, well, sharks smell blood. How much can they really learn isn't the right word, but at the time that was the word that I used because hey, I was still in the kiddie pool. I still needed to learn the right terminology, but can they sense differences in the blood chemistry of the blood that they're smelling? So I went to Dominique because she was the only ichthyologist on staff, on the faculty at Millersville. And I said, okay, here's my question. And at this point, she didn't know me from anybody. I was just another undergrad. And so she looked at me and she said, well, if you're interested in that, and then she handed me a book that's 800 pages, Sensory Biology of Sharks, Skates, and Rays. It was put out by the Office of Naval Research back in the 70s. And she drops it down on the desk and she says, the answer might be in here. And I don't know to this day, I've never asked her this, but I wonder if she pointed me towards that book because that was sort of the test to separate, the people who just, are really interested in sharks from the people who really want to study sharks. But in any event, I said, okay, if that's the book I need to read, that's the book I need to read. I went to the library, signed out a copy, read the pertinent sections, went back to her maybe a month later, and I had a 3-ring binder full of papers, some of which I just understood maybe 30% of. Others I read multiple times and said, good, I got this. This is good. But I went in, I had this big 3-ring binder full of papers because I'm a technological Luddite and I print everything out. And I dropped that on her desk. And I think that was the moment that she looked and she said, okay, so here's a kid who I send him away and he comes back with, 100 or so papers.
More information. Yeah.
Right. And so that turned into an undergrad research project, not necessarily testing the sensitivity of the olfactory apparatus in sharks, but just trying to answer the basic question, well, look, could sharks detect hormonal differences, which then led to the question, do sharks use pheromones? Because pheromones are kind of like hormones. They're basically chemical messengers that instead of staying in the body, they leave the body and they are received by usually a conspecific, so an organism of the same species, usually received by a conspecific organism, and that elicits a physiological response. So the question became, do sharks use pheromones? And there was a lot of anecdotal evidence, people doing field studies saying, well, we see this sort of cupping and flaring behavior of the pelvic fins, and it would make sense. The theory is there that sharks would use pheromones, but do they actually have the machinery to receive a pheromone signal in their olfactory epithelium? And that's where Dominique said, well, let's go out and we'll introduce you to sharks. We'll introduce you to histology and scanning electron microscopy and all that stuff, just to say what cells are present on the olfactory epithelia of sharks, and how do they compare to the cells that are known to be pheromone receptor cells in other vertebrate species. And I look back on that and I think, man, I wonder what would have happened if I had really pushed through and developed that into my graduate work. But that work was good enough to, A, get me to Minneapolis to present a poster on the subject at the AES conference. And B, it also was good enough to get me to go to Shoals Marine Lab in the Gulf of Maine to deliver lecture material in a shark biology course relating to the endocrinology and behavior of sharks. And so I did that, and that's where I met Willie Beamish, who it turns out was Dominique's doctoral advisor, but Willie was the director of Shoals Marine Lab at the time. And that's a really wonderful place because it's very collaborative. You have people who are studying everything from seagulls and snails up to sharks coming to Shoals. And there was an archaeologist excavating the remains of fishing camps on the Isles of Shoals. So the fishermen would come out back in the 19th century and they'd set up a fishing camp and they'd process their fish, they'd dry the cod. And so this archaeologist was excavating it and he was finding shark teeth And he was saying, but I don't know what these shark teeth belong to. I don't know what species they belong to. And I happened to look at a couple of them and I said, I can tell you, because flashback to middle school, Josh, growing up outside of Philadelphia, I wasn't able to go to the beach every day, but I could get shark teeth. I could go to different websites. I could go to different fossil shows and museums, and I could look at shark teeth. So I knew a little something about shark teeth. And I said, so I can tell that archaeologist what these shark teeth come from. And Willie said, that's great. You ever want to do more with shark teeth? I said, well, if the opportunity presents itself, sure, why not? He said, why don't you follow me back to Cornell? We'll see if we can get you into the EEB program at Cornell to do some work with shark teeth. And the rest, as they say, is history. Because that was my entry into shark feeding and form-function relationships and comparative anatomy and shark systematics, because shark teeth have been used to sort of sort out the evolutionary history of sharks. So it was a really influential move. And here's something that I need to give Dominique a little bit of grief for this. Because when I was her student, and I said, I remember exactly where we were. We were in her car driving to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. And I said, I really would like to do something with shark teeth. And she said, no, shark teeth? Come on. Everybody does stuff with shark teeth. That's boring. Stick with the pheromones. And I said, well, okay, but, shark teeth, you can study in Ithaca, New York. Shark pheromones, a little more logistically challenging, So, who knows? Maybe at some point in my career, I'll circle back around and say, hey, let's, here's an interesting opportunity to poke at shark pheromones, but who knows?
When Josh was an undergrad, showing all this very keen interest in this stories he just shared with Dominique and I have been collaborators for many years, and she actually had contacted me, I think, originally unbeknownst to Josh, about, hey, I've had this really good student here who's looking for a master's program. And she sent me the stuff he had done. And I looked at it and said, wow, this guy's really got it really seems to have very good direction, again, in terms of what he wants to do. But the thing is I couldn't really advance Josh because it was really cool, but it was in an area I wasn't familiar with. And so by Josh going to the Scholl's lab and working with Willie Beamish, who was Dominique's professor, that kind of laid the path for him to go on to do his master's and eventually a PhD. Now, I wanted to share that for undergraduates that are listening to this episode. When you're looking for an advisor to go to, you want to try to find somebody that matches what you're going to do, because a lot of times we'll get an email from somebody. It's to be a nicely written letter, a good CV, but you want to go find somebody that you can go whose lab they can help advance what your interest is in. And Josh is a good example, like great student, great CV, good interest, but it was just I didn't have that expertise to help him. But he found somebody that did have that expertise that could help advance him. So that's just a kind of something for the students listening to the show that are thinking of applying to grad school. They should think about, like, look at what the person in the lab that's doing. Don't just think like I want to get into a grad program. If you have some direction, find somebody who has an interest in that, because that will help you out in terms of show you have some direction and you're actually contacting somebody in that area.
Absolutely, that's good advice. That's very good advice, Dave. And the other thing I'll add to that is, it's competitive, it really is. And getting into grad school, in fact, getting into shark science as a discipline and staying in shark science and being productive in shark science, I liken it in many ways. It's not a perfect analogy, but it works, to trying to break into show business. That is, you got your audition tape, which is the work you do as an undergrad, and you need to show that there's promise there. If you just point to your transcript and say, look, I got all A's. Well, first of all A's, a 4.0, that's very nice, and you should be proud of that. I'm not knocking that. Academic achievement is something you should be proud of. But an A in a course is no guarantee of a long and productive career in research. So you want to make sure that your audition tape, that is the letters that you're sending and the copies of the CV that you're sending to potential advisors, you want to make sure that shows something that sets you apart. It shows a mindset. It shows a way of looking at things. So even if you're like me and you say, well, it just wound up being a nice undergrad honors project that didn't get published anywhere, that's okay, because it was enough to get my foot in the door and get people looking at me saying, I think this Moyer guy he's got something. He's got a way of approaching scientific research problems that I could work with.
You went to an American Elasmobranch Society meeting, which particularly if you're an undergraduate, you can contact a lot of people around the country, professors, but Josh went and gave a poster. And if you're going to go to the meeting, first of all, if you're an undergrad, try to go to a meeting, because you'll meet pretty much anybody there that you might want to work in their lab. And you have a chance and people there are generally very friendly. They're easily approachable. And again, Josh, you can share your experiences. But the first time I met you was at an AAS meeting in person. I already knew a little bit about you through Dominique, but the fact you went there and you did a poster, because when you do a poster, people are just, they're walking around, they're maybe having a drink, they'll stop by, they'll read your poster, and you can see their name tag, like, oh, hey, I want to talk to Dave, or I want to talk to Dominique, or I want to talk to Willie, or whoever it is. It's just a magnet to meet people. It's a good icebreaker. So again, young undergrad students that are looking for grad programs, it's a little bit of an expense to do, but most of the American Elasmobranch Society meetings you would attend, you'll meet pretty much anybody there you'll want to go work in their lab. And I can't, and plus the other key part of it is to talk to other grad students, because I'm sure I know Josh did, because he talked to a lot of my grad students at the time, and they could tell you about what it's like to be in different people's labs.
Absolutely. And, the other great thing about going to these conferences is the networking, as you've already pointed out, Dave, but also you listen to people's talks, people that you haven't interacted with before, or you might not be aware of the papers they've published. And you're sitting there and you're listening to the talk. Some of them are groundbreaking. It's the first time the work's been presented in public. So you're hearing, in some cases, sort of the world premiere of a fascinating bit of research in the field of shark biology. And that, in and of itself, is pretty cool, but sometimes the cool factor is magnified by the fact that it gets your imagination going. It gets your wheels turning. So then you go back and you say, okay, even if I can't collaborate with this person for, one reason or another, maybe it's because I'm not doing exactly what they're doing, but the way that they articulated X, Y, and Z gives me a new perspective on the problem I'm working on or the area that I'm interested in. And so not only is there the networking benefit, but there's the intellectual stimulation that comes along with going to these conferences. So I think it's definitely worth doing, to echo your point, Dave. The other point that I'll make is, and I tell this to my current students, right now I'm a lecturer at Yale, which is a very prestigious Ivy League institution. But the point that I'll tell them is, okay, we're sitting in comparative anatomy, or we're sitting in the biology of sharks, both courses that I teach there. And I'll say to them, what you've learned today in this lecture, what I've stood in front of you and talked about for the last 50 minutes, is nothing that you couldn't have learned somewhere else, or from a collection of textbooks, or in the library. The thing that makes your college experience at a university that has resources, the thing that makes that a special experience, is whether or not you take advantage of the opportunities outside the classroom. Will you knock on someone's door to their lab and say, hi, I know you do this, I'm interested in that. Do you have an opportunity for me to work in your lab? Sometimes it's just for something as simple as, hey, do you need help cleaning your lab, just as an entry level, but those are the experiences that lead to the sorts of things that really make it obvious, hey, you're coming from a special place. So for the people who say, oh, I can't get into, for one reason or another, whether it's finances or grades or whatever, I can't get into this particular institution, Does that mean that I can't be a shark scientist? No, absolutely not. What it means is you might have to work just a little bit harder to distinguish yourself and prove that you are capable of conducting good science. Because good science really is, it's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of interacting with the world and exploring the world. So you want to prove that you can do that. And you don't need to be at an Ivy League school to prove it. But if you're not at an Ivy League school, if you're not at a school that has all these great resources for research, we would call them R1 institutions, then you got to be a little more creative and say, okay, well, how do I demonstrate that side of myself in the absence of those resources? And I'm walking, talking proof that it is completely doable. You just got to be a little creative, and you got to have the right support network.
I say the same thing, in terms of enjoy your institution. Don't just go to the classes, do the homework and things like that. Enjoy the labs, the research that goes on there. Get involved in some sort of way, not only from an opportunity to take everything you can from that university or college, but also to pad your resume with experience that you may or may not get. I always tell people that you're doing a 4-year degree, you could potentially be in 4 different labs each year, and judging on your passion and just getting involved and working with different labs if you can. And even I'm sure there's going to be some collaboration between labs and working on different projects and different, like some labs may be all in a laboratory. Others might have a field component to it. Others might pay you. Some don't. Maybe it's a volunteer position, but you get as much experience. You're paying enough money for it. You might as well get more than just the classroom and the lectures and the sort of the labs that you have to do as part of the course. You might as well go and be part of that professor's lab or that lecturer's lab and get into the research and multiple labs if you can. That's the ideal setting to do that in, because once you've graduated, it's hard to get back in because other people are trying to get in too that are undergraduates, and they're going to undergraduate students that they're going to take before you. So I always recommend to people in undergraduates to get involved as quickly as possible. So I'm glad to hear that you're saying the same thing. I think that's really great. How would you expect people to kind of set themselves apart, as you say? Like what would you say people would do, whether they get into an Ivy League school, whether they get into a school that is known for marine science or not?
Sure. Well, I'll preface this by saying everybody's different, right? Every PI, every principal investigator is looking for some very common things. Everybody wants a grad student who's responsible and has a good work ethic, but then there's also room for individual variation. It might be that the PI says, well, I'm working on a project, and for one reason or another, I just don't happen to have the expertise in, say, R or Python or a coding language. So it might be that that's the sort of X factor that you say, well, gosh, as an undergrad, if you can develop those skills, that really ups your marketability. Because you never know what the X factor is going to be. That's why they call it an X factor. If there was a formula where you could just say, look, tick these boxes and you get into grad school, then everybody would do it. Right? So I'll speak for myself and say, if an undergrad student comes to me and says, okay, Dr. Moyer, I know you study sharks and shark teeth and jaws and feeding. I want to do that. I want to work with you. Then I guess the first question that I have for them is, what have you read up until now? Because if you're coming to me saying that you've had this deep and passionate interest and you were so excited to see that I was offering this course and doing this kind of work, then all right, presumably you've read something about it. You've read a little of the peer-reviewed literature, and you've certainly, I would hope, have dabbled in the gray literature and have read things like field guides and things like that. So tell me about it. And sometimes the students rise to the occasion and they'll say, oh, well, okay, really? Just any paper? And I'll say, yeah, well, pick a paper that you thought was really interesting that you read in the last 6 months. Tell me about it. Because how they articulate it, what they zero in on, is going to tell me an awful lot about how they approach scientific problems and what they think is interesting and where their aptitudes lie. If they say, peer-reviewed literature, what's that? Well, that also tells me something. And I still might work with them. I think everybody deserves a shot to learn. But it just means that now I'm filing away in the back of my head saying, okay, this person needs to play a little catch up, and I'll work with them to do it. I'll if they're interested, if they're a good person and they work hard and they're willing to put the time in, I'm willing to put the time in. Absolutely. But to answer your question, Andrew, how do you define yourself or elevate yourself beyond your peers? I would say show up with a command of what's been done, so that way you're ready to talk about what will be done and what you will do in the future.
Yeah, I like that idea. I like coming in with like at least a question or a hypothesis to say, this is what I'm interested based on what you've been doing. This is the questions that I have. And whether you choose that question to explore or not is a good way to say how passionate this person is about what they're doing, because they've already come up with that question. They've already formulated based on the stuff that they've read in the past and the research they've done through your lab and whatnot. They've been able to figure that out. So I like that idea. Another idea too is, for me, what worked for me, I didn't have great grades coming out of undergrad, and I had to do a makeup semester. But what got me back in and in favor with my supervisor was I was out there being a marine technician, and he needed a marine technician. And so I worked for him while I did my graduate student, all these other projects that he was doing. I was ordering CTDs, and I was doing all the maintenance, and I was, handling the small boat and going out and taking students and teaching them how to use all this instrumentation. And I got to work on some pretty cool projects around Nova Scotia and so forth, where I did my master's at Acadia. And so I got to do a master's, plus I got much more experience, not only using the equipment and different types of equipment, but also teaching methodologies and working with other graduate students and undergrad students. And so I was able to kind of slip myself in there. I still had to work a little harder to get back in good favor with the university, so that they knew I could do it. But I aced all my courses going back in. I had that passion. It was just something I needed to do. I just needed to figure out. But it was one way of just giving the experience that you already have and bringing it to that lab. If they need that just comes in handy, because then you have all that extra skill set that you can bring to that lab, which they may not have been able to get out of a student, or like I said, they could have taught it to that student, but there's growing pains in there, right?
Absolutely. Now here's another thing that I'll just throw out there, because we spend a lot of time talking about academia. How do you make the jump from undergrad to grad school? Yeah. And that can lead you to the very, I think, false impression that if you don't go to grad school, forget it. There's no place for you in shark science. And that is absolutely not the case. Just the other week, I was listening to your Beyond Jaws podcast with Chris Fallows. He's a great example of somebody who dedicates his life, his professional life anyway, to wildlife, and not just any wildlife, but the great white sharks of South Africa. And he made some great contributions, wonderful contributions, with his photographs and documenting behaviors and just going out and spending time on the water and seeing things that people hadn't seen before, and then documenting it. So he's an example, and there are lots of examples. And so I guess I would just say, for all the time that we spend talking about academia, the reality is the cost of higher education is ridiculously prohibitive for a lot of people. And that's coming from a guy who works behind the wall, behind the gate. I'm in higher education, and even I'm looking around saying, like, if my students weren't of a particular background or socioeconomic class, they'd have a really hard time getting into this position. So that's one of the reasons why I've also put time into education and outreach initiatives like this massive open online shark course, MOOC, MOOC. We just call it Shark MOOC, massive open online course. And Is it as comprehensive and in-depth as a college shark biology course? No, but of course the flip side is, because it's online, we can go off and shoot videos in remote parts of the world, or we have colleagues who will send us videos from remote parts of the world, or they'll Skype or Zoom in and we'll interview them. So students can take this course for free. All you need is an internet connection. And you can Google it. You can go to Shark MOOC, and it's offered usually once a year in the summer. And like I said, it's free. Now, if you want to use it for continuing education credits, you can do that. We have a verified track where you can pay a little money and get a certificate at the end of it. But all the core content is there for learners to access for free for the 4 weeks during the summer that it's up and running, because sharks are so fascinating and they're so interesting and wonderful, and learning about them can be so much fun, and you get the enthusiasm of all the people who are doing the shark research, and it starts to snowball. And that should not be limited to the people who can pay tuition. That should be something that everybody who has an interest can pursue that.
Let's back up. Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of how the whole Shark MOOC started, how you got involved with it?
Yeah. So I had just finished my master's with Willie Beamish at Cornell. And it was at a time, 2014, when Cornell, forward thinking as they were at the time, said, look, the face of higher education is changing. You know, you're going to get to a point where people are going to be taking more and more courses online. They're going to want a wider variety of courses. So we have an initiative for faculty members to develop these massive open online courses. And at that point, it was very fortuitous, because I was looking at Willie and Willie was looking at me, and we were at that awkward sort of, okay, what next? You got the master's done, but what's next for you? And so Willie said, well, hey, why don't we take advantage of this initiative? And so we pitched the idea of this free shark course. And that's one of the things about sharks. You say sharks and people tend to perk up and they go, what, sharks? You know, you don't have to convince people that other people will find it interesting. Now, of course, sometimes that's a double-edged sword, because when you start applying for funding or things like that, or you really want to be taken seriously in the ichthyological community, the people will sort of look at you and say, oh, you're a shark biologist. You're one of those, where's your cowboy hat? That kind of thing. But by and large, the upside is, hey, if I tell you that I study sharks, I guarantee you're going to have a shark story to tell me. Oh, really? I watched Shark Week. I saw Jaws. Whatever. So there was the interest there. There was the opportunity. Cornell was willing to put up some of the seed funding for development. And then Willie and I just went wild, and we said, okay, we have 4 weeks to work with. Let's start with shark evolution and systematics, and we'll transition to anatomy and physiology. Then we'll look at neurobiology and behavior, and then we'll look at conservation and shark-human interaction. So we'll touch a wide variety of topics. So there's a little something there for everybody, I think. Whatever part of shark biology you're fascinated by, we talk about it. And if nothing else, it may even get you interested in another part of shark biology that you didn't consider. You might have said, well, I knew all about shark teeth, for example, but I didn't know about jaw suspension and the way that factors into the feeding performance. Or I knew that scientists go out and tag sharks, but I didn't know you could track them online using different apps with the different types of tags. Spot tags versus acoustic tags versus the traditional little spaghetti tags that the National Marine Fisheries Service used to use back in the day. So there are lots of different little nuances that hopefully the students of Shark MOOC can look at and they go, I didn't think about that, but now that I am thinking about that, that's pretty cool. And we always make sure that our students don't just get a blurb of trivia. They get names and faces to put with the names. They see the people who are doing the research, or I should say they see some of the people who are doing the research, because every year new people enter the field and we try to profile them as best we can. But then students in Shark MOOC actually have names and faces to put with the different topics. So then they have people who, if they are interested in pursuing it further, they have people to write to. They have people to reach out to. And also, I'll just, nothing against Shark Week or National Geographic, but every year you get a small handful of the shark scientists represented on those shows. So Shark MOOC gives us an opportunity to highlight some of the shark scientists that you may not have seen on those shows. So I like to think that it is sort of riding the crest of a wave that hopefully will sweep through higher education, and access to these sorts of courses will just continue to grow, because we've had over 35,000 students since we launched Shark MOOC from more than 170 countries. So this really is amazing. Massive. It really is global. And you know what my favorite stat is, Dave? Because we ask the students, we say, tell us a little bit about yourself. We want to know, who we're teaching. And part of the questionnaire is student age. And our oldest respondent was in their mid-90s, and our youngest was 7.
Wow. That's amazing. Wow.
So that's 170 amazing. Questions, 170 countries, and an age range
big demographic.
Of 8 decades.
Yeah.
And I mean, this shows you how absolutely fascinated people are by sharks. There is definitely a hunger to learn more. And I think that now that we've met with a modicum of success in Shark MOOC, we have groups like the Save Our Seas Foundation that recognize the progress we've made, and they say, well, what do you need to keep that going? Expand that a little bit. And Dave, you've written, how many books now? Good number. So you know just as well as anybody that the moment you write the book, the next day it's out of date. It's ready for the second edition, right? Well, Shark MOOC is kind of like that. We finish it one year. We say, okay, we've gotten the videos in. We have new graphics. We have updated shark attack statistics. We have updated species counts. By the time this rolls around next year, we're going to need to update that. So having support from people, whether it be individuals that say, hey, we really like this, I think we'll upgrade to the verified track and kick in a couple bucks, or the Save Our Seas Foundation, or basically any of the partners that we partner with to say, hey, can we come document the sharks at your institution? And they say, yeah, sure. Invaluable support. Really, really critical to the success of Shark MOOC and the dissemination of that information.
You had a more senior person, Willie Beamish, involved in the project, who's been around the block a few times. And you as a young, graduate student at the time, it had to have been a tremendous opportunity, because you basically, the two of you were pioneering this entire area of online, not necessarily online courses, but as far as an online shark course. I mean, I can't think of any other shark online course out there that's comparable to what you guys do in terms of the scope, the 35,000 plus students you've had involved in it, 170 plus countries. I mean, that's phenomenal. That's a phenomenal reach you guys have had. And you being a young up and coming shark researcher must have had to been a tremendous experience for you.
It really was. It was, I was very fortunate to be brought in on the ground floor. And I mean, I was there in the planning meetings. It was basically Willie and I would sit down at his desk, and he would say, what do you think is interesting? What do you think people should know about sharks? And we based it to some degree on the shark course that we both taught at Shoals. So that was a great skeleton, if you will. But then as we made the transition to the online medium, we realized, well, there's some things that you can't duplicate the classroom experience. We can't be up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's global. So you got learners on the other side of the world. So you have to make content videos. Okay, so now what do you put in the video, and how do you script that, and how do you phrase this, and how do you phrase it in a way that doesn't lead to questions or isn't ambiguous, because people don't have the option to just throw their hand up and say, "Hey, Dr. Moyer, what do you mean by that?" So it really was a very welcomed challenge, because it's given me the tools going forward that I think has made me a better teacher since starting Shark MOOC. And so, credit where credit is due. Thank you very much, Willie Beamish, for bringing me into the fold as early on in the process as he did. And I guess the other thing that I'd say is, and this goes back to the point about being a well-rounded individual and developing skills that could be useful in other situations. When we were making Shark MOOC, I really did feel like there was a show business component to it. We would go into a camera a filming studio, and you'd see this big professional camera, and you'd have the teleprompters, and you have the professional lights in the background. And you get a little touch of makeup so there isn't any glare, and in fact they would coach you, and they'd say, we have people from the drama department saying, when you deliver this line, maybe you should try it like this. And you have people walking around with light meters saying, okay, how do we light this? Because if you bungle it, if you don't make a compelling video, people are going to scroll right through it. And that's one of the things that you talk about, the changing face of higher education. That's something that the people who only ever teach in person, they don't feel the heartache that comes from knowing that somebody is just scrolling over them, but when you're doing it online, if somebody's not interested, if you haven't set the hook, if you haven't made people pay attention, I got news for you. The whole internet is one click away.
Yeah. You're competing with a lot.
So, it brought up an interest for me. I go back and I watch nature documentaries, and I'm looking at the cinematography. I'm looking at the lighting. I'm looking at the editing. I'm looking at the sound mixing, or I'm listening to the sound mixing. And so having had that experience, I can appreciate things that I grew up watching on a whole new level. So it's not just the shark content, it's also the production content. So, talk about the importance of being a well-rounded individual. And the more well-rounded you are, the more interesting the world becomes.
Well, and it's interesting too. We're in a series, or we're in a situation or a point of time where we have all access to statistics. If you have a YouTube channel, you have access to find out how long people are listening to your videos, when they're going away, where they're going, all this kind of stuff, just like website analytics, like Google Analytics and things like that. Through that platform that you're using for the MOOC, do you have, you kind of mentioned a little bit of statistics of whether they're going to a different video or they keep scrolling. Do you have statistics in terms of how long people are listening to the video or and things like that?
We do. We have those statistics. There's something magical about the 5 to 7 minute interview. People will watch those, and there's also something interesting. The more live shark footage you put into the videos, now you can push the boundaries and say, well, now we can do 8 minutes, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, so the more B-roll that you
speak over
exactly.
It. Yeah.
Because people love sharks. They don't. My mom told me that I'm an exceptionally good-looking young man, but for whatever reason, the rest of the world didn't seem to get that memo. And so if you don't put live shark footage in. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she's great. But if you don't put live shark footage in, I don't care how good looking I am. People seem to just scroll past me, so that's the lesson you learn, and a little hit to the ego, but there you go. Lesson learned.
Now let's talk about, I think it's really interesting how you're constantly evolving as a presenter, as a teacher, trying to maintain that attention span in a time where attention is a huge commodity. But let's talk about the students for a minute here. Obviously, a wide range of age, cultural backgrounds, probably professional backgrounds. What did you like in terms of when you, even the purpose even it's probably evolved since you started, but what do you hope that the students have after they're going through the course? So they come in with and I guess what the other question, I guess before that is, what do they come in with? What sort of perceptions do they come in with before the course, and sort of what do you hope and what kind of perceptions do they have afterwards?
That's a great question, Andrew, because what students bring to the table, I mean, first of all, every student's an individual, right? No two individuals are the same. So you get this wide variety, and sometimes I'm surprised. I hear somebody say something like, well, I always thought this, or sometimes they tell me a story. In the discussion posts, they'll say, well, when I was growing up, my uncle, who happened to be a shark biologist and then name a country, always said this, So I'm always, I'm listening when people come in at the beginning, because no two people bring exactly the same suite of characteristics and background. I would also point out that, I've mentioned Cornell very prominently in this because that's where I was based. The University of Queensland in Australia is a partner in Shark MOOC. Dr. Ian Tibbets, down at Heron Island, so just on the edge of the Great Barrier Reef. He also has been very influential. And so, for example, when we wanted footage of epaulet sharks crawling over the reef at low tide, he's like, yeah, I can do that. I can get that for you. And so that also attracted a large number of students from Australia. And so it was interesting just to hear that the national background actually affects how people perceive sharks, because it affects the experiences that they have and what they have access to when it comes to experiencing sharks and learning about shark biology. So it's really interesting to see that there are obviously going to be a couple similarities. I've always thought sharks were cool because they're big, or because, I love the breaching great white sharks in South Africa or whatever. But then you get some really interesting stories that you say, wow, that could only come from somebody with this particular background or coming from this particular part of the world. And so that's really fun. And then as far as what I hope people leave the course with, I would say, whether it's Shark MOOC or comparative vertebrate anatomy or, any course that I teach, I hope what they leave with is something that Willie Beamish used to call new eyes. Basically, new ways to look at things that have been in front of you all this time, but now you have a new way of looking at it and you can appreciate it on a new level. And I think any course, any good course, whether it's economics or biology or philosophy or whatever, that's what it does for you. It gives you new lenses to look at the world around you.
That's really interesting. And I almost feel like there's a social science study in the participants after the course in terms of how their behavior has changed in their thoughts about sharks and just sort of their lives around sharks. I'm sure some of them are fishers. I'm sure some of them, have any of them actually gone into science or gone into research that have been inspired by the course or sort of more fueled by the course to go into not necessarily research, but conservation, and like not going like an academic route, but just getting involved in conservation?
I know that we've had students who circle back around, so they take it 1 year and they circle back around the next year, they take it again, and then they put in the comments, hey, this is my second time taking it, so here's what's changed in my life since the first time. And we've had students that have said, I've gone out and I've applied for and gotten this internship, whether it be an internship at an aquarium or with the National Marine Fisheries Service or down at a marine lab, whatever. But yes, we have had students that say, based on what you exposed us to, I went off and I did X, Y, and Z. And that's incredibly gratifying.
Oh, absolutely. Have you ever, I know this course takes up a lot of time, obviously, you put in a lot of work, and also that your collaborators put in a lot of work. would you like to see, and what course would you like to see? Like, obviously this provides a big background on a species that people are interested in, they're scared of, they're, they find there's mystery in this, and you're essentially providing the answers to a lot of their questions throughout this course. Is there like a course that you would like to see that maybe on a different subject matter, either a different species or a different subject, that you think would be beneficial that people take?
Yes, absolutely. I think that these days people should take a course in civil rhetoric and debate. I think those skills have been lost. So I did the jaded cynic in me who can't stand watching the news anymore. I would say seriously though. I mean, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but I
agree though.
I think that people lose sight of the fact that there is a philosophy aspect to how we interact with each other. And also, I mean, okay, so Dave, you and I have PhDs. What does the PH stand for? Well, philosophy, right? It's the love of knowledge, and it's the way of looking at the world and how you approach it and how you make sense of it. And so I would say it would be really cool. I would be really interested in seeing a course that is looking at the philosophy of natural science and how that has changed over the course of human history. Because, well, we know it has. I mean, even in my discipline, being anatomy, vertebrate anatomy, you go back to the foundations of comparative anatomy. That you go all the way back to the ancient Chinese, the ancient Egyptians, and after them, the Greeks. There was just an incredible explosion of comparative anatomy in the Renaissance. For the shark enthusiasts, I highly recommend you look up Nicholas Steno. He was the first person in the Western world anyway to look at the fossilized teeth of sharks and then look at the teeth of modern sharks and say, I think these things are related. I think I'm looking at, because before that they used to call fossilized shark teeth in Renaissance Europe tongue stones, and the explanation was, well, those are the tongues of old dragons and serpents that died before we got here, which also explains why we're finding them on the top of a mountain where there aren't any oceans. Right? So it was Steno that came along and said, well, first of all, I think the world may not have always looked the way it does right now. Okay. Ding, ding, ding. Big insight. And in addition, I think that there were organisms like the ones that we have today that were living in that world that doesn't look like the world we have now. And those organisms may or may not be like the organisms that we have now. So this is something that, back in the 1600s, this guy's looking at it and he's going, I see it. Now, how does that relate to a change in the philosophy? Well, if you're approaching the natural world from a theological philosophy, you have no incentive to ask those questions, right? Now, to add another wrinkle to it, you know what Steno did after his days as an anatomist? He went off and became a bishop. All right? And in fact, back in the 90s, the Catholic Church actually elevated him and said, look, we're deifying him. Look, this guy was a pioneer. He's really great. So again, you talk about how philosophy shapes the way that you approach things and interpret it, and what you, the significance that you project upon what you observe. I mean, this is something that seems like semantics and just sort of dry rhetoric, but we take it for granted.
Yeah, no doubt.
It gets us into the thing about knowing the history of your profession. And so, because there's that expression about, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat yourself. And you see people that are doing things now, you have people that before you, whether it's Steno or other people there that kind of laid a foundation, you want to build up. from that. You don't want to keep repeating yourself. And I think a lot of, as I always stress to my students, we always have like, I always have students in my lab talk about, it's like, pick some historical figure in the field, talk about them, Moyer and Handley or Steno or somebody like that. So they get so they get a historical perspective of what's been done in the past. And I think that's a lot of the younger people in sort of your generation and younger really are missing out on. You not you per se. And there's others like you that know the history, that know some of the philosophy of what came before, because you want to advance the field. You don't want to be just repeating yourself. And so I think it's a really critical point. I hope people listening to the show understand what you're saying here about like just learning your history of the field, knowing about the people that came before you.
When you have a field like shark science that's relatively new as a discipline unto itself, the students within that field, you got to work a little harder to find the foundational studies, right? Because prior to 1975, when Jaws came out, and then the subsequent years after that, that I think we're all in agreement. That's when shark science as a discipline, that's when shark biology as a discipline really took form. That is not, absolutely not to say that people were not interested in or studying sharks before that, but you don't have an AES, for example, right? So now you have to go and you have to dig in journals that you may not otherwise have read, or journals that encompass a broad spectrum of topics, and you're looking for just one paper. I mean, a great example is John Treadwell Nichols, who worked at the American Museum of Natural History in the early 1900s, right? This is the guy who actually founded the journal of the American Society of Ichthyology and Herpetology. He named it Copiah after Edward Drinker Cope, who is a problematic individual, to say the least. He had some problematic views, and perhaps rightfully so. The name of the journal was changed to Ichthyology and Herpetology. But the point is, John Treadwell Nichols, he founded that journal back in the early 1900s.
1913, I think. Yeah.
1913, I believe so. Yes. Yeah. I should probably know that as an ASIH member, but, early 1900s. So Nichols was also the ichthyologist that when the Jersey shark attacks in 1916 were happening, he was the ichthyologist that they called to come in and consult and say, hey, what's going on here? But if we had gone up to Nichols, my suspicion is if we hopped in a time machine and went to visit John Treadwell Nichols and said, I work in the field of shark biology, he would have looked at you and said, the what? Because up until that point, shark biology was just sort of an offshoot of ichthyology. It's like there were no shark biologists. There were ichthyologists who happened to dabble in sharks from time to time. Nichols himself actually dabbled in ornithology, So that goes back to knowing the history of your discipline. And I think the reason why a lot of people have a little trouble with that is because in shark biology, the discipline is rooted, has very, very deep roots that go all the way back to the origins of comparative anatomy. I mean, Aristotle was the guy who named claspers, for crying out loud. So ancient Greeks were even looking at sharks and saying, these are interesting fish. But if you're looking for simple, Googleable, I'm a shark expert, well, the field of shark biology as a discipline didn't really show up until, your lifetime, Dave.
Yeah, well, we've heard we had Chris Lowe on earlier in the year. And Chris Lowe, if you listen to the episode, he grew up in Martha's Vineyard when they were actually filming Jaws. And as he mentioned in the episode, if you haven't listened to it, go listen to it. The two boys that played the sheriff's sons, they were like schoolmates of his. He was going to school with. And so that we kind of coined that sort of, people like Chris and myself and others were sort of that Jaws generation that started out. And the thing I try to emphasize to young people is that, we're not talking like in ichthyology, like talking about somebody who's been dead for 120 years. We're still very much alive, most of us. We're kind of in the latter part of our careers, but we still go to the AAS, the American Elasmobranch Society meetings, and we're still around. It's like, come talk to us, because we were the people that started out in the modern era of shark research, and you can learn a lot from us. I kind of give a little bit of a pat and the back for people of my generation, but it's really is a thing that you don't often have, that historical perspective where you can go talk to, like, like I knew Eugenie Clark, and I knew other people from that era that I got to know. And you talk to people like Gavin Naylor, who was on the show, and he's part of that Jaws generation. He was an actual grad student of Genie's. And so, so you got people here, you can get firsthand accounts on what's going on. And you had Willie Beamish was one of your mentors, Dominique Didier. You have people that were like right at the forefront. Dominique was like, she's like the most accomplished female shark taxonomist of all time. And she's still very much active in her career. And I would bet you outside you, and Andrew's heard me blab on about this, but there's really not a lot of people wouldn't know that. Here's, you got like the most accomplished person here who's still a professor, very active in her career. You go talk to about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll say another reason to talk to people in your generation is because you grew up with people from the previous generation, and which you might have come to appreciate as you've gone through graduate school and through your work. And again, I'll sing Willie's praises and say, this is the guy who introduced me to people like Glenn Northcutt, who's a world-class comparative anatomist. I know Kara Yopak talked about him when she was on the show. And, Glenn, I met him when he had one foot out the door. He had just retired. In fact, Kara came to his lab and took all the brains 1 week, and then I came out with Willie the next week, and we took whatever was left, which, by the way, nothing quite beats the thrill of cruising 85 miles an hour in the middle of the night across the Arizona desert in a U-Haul full of brains. Yeah. Just hoping you don't get stopped by a border agent saying, "What's in the back of the truck?" It's like, well, a bunch of brains.
Yeah.
Are you ready for this? Are you ready for this, officer?
Yeah, brace yourself. I guarantee you haven't heard this one before. Maybe. Well, I mean, so you meet people like Glenn Northcutt, and then he gives me a lot of his books. Thank you, Glenn. I'm a bibliophile. I love the books, and they're books, hand signed from people like Perry Gilbert. John McCosker.
I was just going to say, you got people like Perry Gilbert, who was at Cornell, big name in the field, and he wrote essentially the textbook that people use for decades on sharks, skates, and rays. And Jeff Carrier, who we just had on the show, his episode's up now, will tell you about them. I mean, that was the book until Jeff's books came along. That was the book you'd go to. You'd go to Perry Gilbert's book, but so that's someone. And again, you know about Perry through Willie. And I was fortunate when I was a young graduate student doing my master's. I met Perry. He was a terrific guy, great guy. Just another one of these really nice, gentlemanly type person, like Jeannie Clark. You could sit down and have a beer and just shoot the breeze with them, and you get to know stuff. And so that's the nice thing about our field is you can connect with people. They're not that far removed, that new people in the field.
The thing is traditionally, you find out more about the people in the history through the stories of the people of those who were graduate students of those people and their graduate students and so forth, just like we've talked about a number of times. But it's difficult because you have to be that person who's connected, or going to an AES meeting, or sitting down and having those conversations. I know for a fact there are some people who will go to a meeting or go to a conference and just not necessarily be in the mood to be able to meet new people and talk to people because they're super introverted or so forth. And so that history does get lost because it's not. There aren't the books are there where you have, the field guides and you have sort of the textbooks that people go to, but you still don't know about the people, and their personalities and their accomplishments and what they did. And to be honest, Dave, when we talked about doing Beyond Jaws, even before the name kind of came up, that was the purpose of this podcast, right? That was one of the main purposes, was to provide that historical context through speaking with different scientists. Some of them are known to be pioneers. Some of them are becoming pioneers and will become pioneers for others down the road in the different generations. And I think that's the fun part. And that's where it becomes more accessible to a lot more people who may or may not be able to go to a meeting. I mean, obviously the past 2 years have 2.5 years have been tough. None of us have been able to go to meetings. And we're just starting to open up now. And so it's nice that to have podcasts like this and other podcasts where you get to hear from those people. Imagine Eugenie having a podcast of her own, back in the day when if podcasts were around, and to hear those stories and to sort of lock them in, to give that history and just to hear from their own, their voice, and their matter. Like that's the wonder of being able to do this, 5, 6, 10 years down the road. I hope that people will be able to listen to this, new students who are just like, oh, who's doing, these courses before, I'd love to know more about them and how that came to be. Now we have the story of how it came to be and so forth. Right. So I think I feel is where, the benefit of doing podcasting and YouTube videos and social media and hearing straight from the scientist's mouth, the conservationist's mouth, the photographer's mouth of how they all, serendipitously been able to do the work that they've been able to do and become the pioneers that they've been able to do. So, I really like this. And getting back to the Shark MOOC, I mean, that's just, it's such an, I think it's such a handy tool to have, because in a time where we need more information, accurate information that goes beyond a news headline, is now. And I feel like when I asked you the question, Josh, I wanted to say, hey, maybe something like climate change or something like energy usage or something that where people can really sink their teeth into. But I mean, the debating and learning about the philosophies, I think it wasn't expected. That's why I didn't kind of want to load the question, but I think that your answer was fantastic. But you imagine courses like in a MOOC sort of a standard where you have multiple professors, multiple teachers, multiple people in the field being able to contribute to, energy usage or climate change or adaptation to changes in the world that we're seeing today.
And Andrew, there are more and more every year that goes by. There are more and more online courses. People are getting the message. They are. I mean, you can go on to there are 2 leading sites, edX.org and the other one's called Coursera. You can Google either of those, and you can see that they have a whole bunch of MOOCs, lots of different stuff. I mean, I was just sitting there auditing a dinosaur biology MOOC just because I thought, that's kind of interesting. Wide variety, computer programming, statistics. They have foreign languages. I mean, people are getting the message. The change is coming. The question is, do you embrace it or do you fight it?
Right.
And a cool thing to add on to what Andrew was just saying, like for someone like you talk to people like later in their career, you get one sort of perspective, but someone like yourself who's earlier in their career, it'll be interesting because with all the digital media and stuff now, you'll be able to come back hopefully in 20 years from now. Hopefully we'll have you on the show again before then, but say in 20 years from now, you can come back and you can listen when you're at a different stage in your career and listen like, gee, what was I saying back at that time in that episode? Where's my career gone? Which kind of leads me to a question like, what do you, Andrew and I always ask, like, what do you view as sort of your next step for your career?
My next step for a career, really, I have 2 parts to that. One is the research and one is the teaching. As far as research is concerned, which, we didn't really talk about. So you have to have me back on.
Well, in 20 years, apparently, we're having you back on.
Let me get my Google Calendar out. I need to scroll 20 years of Google Calendar.
Talk more about your orgasmic research.
Yeah. Oh, it's exciting. It's exciting. It's
exciting.
Darn near orgasmic. But anyway, so to answer your question, Dave, which I think is a very thoughtful question in spite of how much I make light of it. But I would say for research, what I'd really like to do is start plugging holes in the literature, and they're basic holes, relative to how fast do sharks bite? How do they use their teeth? Because we have some answers, but they really focus disproportionately on small captive sharks. Well, for obvious reasons, that they're the easiest ones to study. But when it comes to deep sea sharks or pelagic sharks, things that you can't get and keep in your lab very easily, a lot of what we know about feeding performance and a lot of the explanations that we have for why their teeth are shaped a certain way or how they use their jaws, it's inference based on what we know from a relatively small handful of sharks. And that's not me poo-pooing inference. That's a very powerful tool. But what I'm saying is I'd like to get out there, take advantage of changes in technology, field portable video systems, and go out with an experienced and scientific eye and say, okay, I'm going to look for environmental variables. I'm going to look for behavioral variables. I'm going to look at performance kinematics, and I'm going to see what relationships exist between them. And I'm going to do that and start plugging the holes, the gaps in the literature for species for which we do not have that information. And then you take a step back and say, now I can talk about evolution. Now I can talk about the relationship between ecology and evolution and selective mechanisms and diversification, whether it be diversification in Neoselachian, so recent sharks, or diversification all the way back, 400 million years. So that's sort of the fun research that I'd like to continue to build up that program and involve students in and get new species represented. And because every time I publish a paper with feeding kinematics, I learn something new. None of the sharks are doing things exactly the same way. And so that's what I want to do for research. And then for teaching, what I'd really like to do is continue to push the boundaries of education and accessibility to that content, right? So online education and even hybrid courses where you say, okay, look, you can take the online component, and if you really are jazzed by it and you got a couple bucks to throw at it, come take the lab course or come take the field course, But the idea is I want to disseminate this stuff. I want to take the courses, I want to leave them in the university, but I want to open the doors as much as possible.
I think that's a great idea. I really like that, both of those sides.
Kind of the final question here, Josh, to wrap things up, is what advice would you give for students considering a career in the field?
Well, I really like Steve Kajura's advice: marry rich.
Then you can do whatever you want. Then you can do whatever you want.
But in all seriousness, I would say foster a sense of creativity, right? And read broadly and be a well-rounded person as much as possible. And when I say be a well-rounded person, I know that's sort of generic, but what I'm saying is, hey, if you're an undergrad and especially if you're at a liberal arts school, take the history courses, take the music appreciation courses, take the film courses, take the philosophy courses, because you're probably not going to have a chance to do that in a couple of years. And you never know where you're going to hear something that in conversation you reference it and somebody goes, oh, so you know about that, do you? Well, here, come on over to my table. And it just turns out to be the director of a marine lab, Right. I mean, that's an example. Right. And I'm pulling that directly from my own personal experience. I'll finish my interview with this real quick story. At Shoals, you have sponsors, people who see the value of Shoals and who see the value of the educational programs at Cornell, right? And they can be very influential financially, right? People know this. You get donors. It's a fact of life. And so I'm teaching a shark lab, up the hill, and I am just absolutely covered in dead stuff, slime, goo. I stink. You can't tell where the scent of dead shark stops and my scent starts. I smelled like death, and I looked like it too. I walked down to ask Willie something, and he was talking to a research donor who happened to be a Cornell alum, has 2 buildings named after the family on the campus. So I started making small talk. I didn't know who this guy was. I've learned, and we're on good terms, and he's actually paid the publication charges for one of my papers, and he's a really nice guy. But I come in, smell like death. He's sitting there sipping a martini or something, and just in passing, he asked me something about the different sharks, and I said, well, I love the biodiversity because you see differences, anatomical differences in the sharks, and it's kind of like listening to classical music. You can hear the same piece of classical music performed by different orchestras under different conductors, and the trained ear can pick up variations, right? The theme is the same, the music's the same, but you get little variations. And I said, that's kind of what I do as a biologist. I look at the anatomical differences, and I say, okay, the theme might be how do you eat, how do you reproduce, how do you breathe? The variations are the different anatomies and behaviors that you see. And this guy looked at me and he said, oh, that's a very worldly way of looking at it, like any good Cornellian. And I said, well, I'm not actually a Cornellian. And he said, well, we have to change that, don't we, Willie? And I was like, now, see, I only just used that metaphor because as an undergrad, I took a music appreciation course. Go figure, And that's the sort of thing that you don't know how it's going to come up. So that's the advice that I would give. Be as open-minded, be as well-rounded, and be well-read as possible.
Yeah, I like that. I really like that. I think, and also it's
advice.
Be yourself, right? Because you're bringing everything you've learned and just bring that into the conversation. I think that's. I think it's
be yourself, because
advice.
Your true person is going to come out sooner or later anyway, and you don't want people to be surprised by it. Unless they say, boy, that Moyer guy is just so much more interesting after an hour of listening to him than I would have thought. Okay, fine, I'll take that.
And his mom was right. He's a good looking guy. She was right.
I'll defer to other people's judgment on that.
Right on.
Great.
Josh, this was amazing to have you on. I know we could go on forever, and we'll definitely won't wait for 20 years to bring you back on the show. That's for sure. But it's been a pleasure to have you on the show and to learn more about the course. If people want to take this course or get more information on this course, where can
we
they
have
go?
A Facebook group, Shark MOOC, MOOC. You can Google it. It's currently hosted on the edX.org platform. Although we might expand, we might go to Coursera, but if you Google Shark MOOC, you'll find us.
Perfect. And we will definitely put the links in so it's easier to find in the show notes. And so thanks again, Josh. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to having you back on.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Andrew. It was great talking with you guys.
Thanks, Josh.